The glamorous facade of Hollywood during its golden age was a masterclass in illusion. Behind the beaming smiles, the tailored tuxedos, and the perfectly manicured estates of the rich and famous lay secrets so devastating they could shatter the flawless images projected on the silver screen. In the spring of 1950, inside the heavy, soundproofed walls of an exclusive psychiatric facility in Beacon, New York, one of these secrets reached a terrifying climax. A beautiful, wealthy, and deeply tormented woman sat alone in her pristine, hospital-issued room. She was the wife of one of America's most beloved actors, the mother of two children, who would grow up to become Hollywood royalty, and a woman entirely broken by a world that demanded perfection while offering no mercy. In her trembling hand, she held a small, stolen razor blade. What drove Frances Ford Seymour, the wife of Henry Fonda, and the mother of Jane and Peter Fonda, to this dark, isolated room? The truth is a harrowing labyrinth of childhood trauma, high society pressures, emotional cruelty, and a desperate search for love in all the wrong places. The tragedy of Frances Fonda is not just a story of a life lost, but a chilling testament to the lethal weight of unspoken pain. If you are ready for this journey into the dark heart of Hollywood history, like the video and subscribe. To understand the tragic end of Frances Ford Seymour, one must trace the roots of her life back to the very beginning, to a world governed by strict rules, immense privilege, and suffocating expectations. She was born on April 4th, 1908, in Brockville, Ontario, Canada. Frances was born into a family that prided itself on its aristocratic heritage. The Seymours claimed distant lineage to Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII, a connection that infused the family with a lingering sense of royal obligation. Her father, Eugene Ford Seymour, was a prominent and successful lawyer, while her mother, Sophie, was a woman deeply entrenched in the social climbing and status maintenance of the early 20th century. From the moment she could walk and talk, Frances was groomed for a very specific purpose. In the upper echelons of North American society during the Edwardian era and the Roaring Twenties, a woman of her standing was not raised to seek personal fulfillment, career aspirations, or emotional independence. She was raised to be an ornament, a flawless hostess, a beautiful companion, and above all, a wife to a man of equal or greater social and financial standing. Frances possessed all the natural attributes required for this role. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with striking features, an elegant carriage, and an innate sense of style that turned heads wherever she went. But beneath the polished veneer of the perfect debutante, a silent and corrosive trauma was already taking root. Decades later, long after the tragedy had concluded, her daughter Jane Fonda would uncover the darkest secret of Frances's childhood. Through a deep dive into sealed medical records and private institutional notes, it was revealed that Frances had been a victim of horrific sexual abuse during her formative years. The abuse was perpetrated by a trusted member of the household, an event that shattered her sense of safety, her self-worth, and her fundamental understanding of love and intimacy. In the austere, image-obsessed world of the 19-teens and 20s, such traumas were never spoken of. There was no therapy, no comfort, no justice. There was only the absolute demand for silence. Frances learned early on that her pain was unacceptable, that her worth was tied entirely to her outward appearance, and that survival meant building an impenetrable wall around her broken spirit. She became a master of compartmentalization, smiling brightly for the cameras and the high society gatherings, while a deep, unnameable anxiety gnawed at her soul. When the family moved to the United States, settling into the elite circles of New York society, the pressure on Frances intensified. She was a dazzling young woman in a city of immense wealth and cutthroat social maneuvering. It was here, in the glittering, champagne-soaked world of the 1920s, that she caught the eye of George Tuttle Brokaw. George was a millionaire lawyer and a prominent sportsman, a man whose wealth was matched only by his formidable reputation in the city's most exclusive clubs. He was also significantly older than Frances and carried the heavy baggage of a highly publicized, bitter divorce from his first wife, the famous writer and eventual ambassador Claire Booth Luce. For the Seymour family, a marriage to George Brokaw was a triumph, a match that secured Frances's financial future and elevated her social standing to the highest possible tier. For Frances, it was the fulfillment of the duty she had been trained for her entire life. In 1931, the 23-year-old Frances married the 51-year-old millionaire. She moved into his palatial mansion on Fifth Avenue, a sprawling, opulent residence that was meant to be her castle, but quickly became her prison. The marriage was a disaster from the very beginning. George Brokaw was a man possessed by his own demons. He was a severe alcoholic prone to terrifying fits of rage and dark, brooding depressions. The Fifth Avenue mansion, with its silent servants and echoing halls, became a house of horrors for the young, fragile Frances. She was isolated, trapped in a loveless and often terrifying dynamic, with a man who viewed her as a possession rather than a partner. Behind the heavy oak doors, the reality of her life was a stark contrast to the glowing society column reports. She endured his drunken tirades, his emotional volatility, and the crushing loneliness of a marriage built entirely on social contract rather than affection. During this dark period, Frances gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Frances de Villers-Brokaw, who would come to be known as Pan. The birth of her daughter brought a flicker of light into the gloom of the Fifth Avenue mansion, but it also anchored Frances more deeply to her volatile husband. She poured her desperately suppressed need for love into her child, trying to shield the young girl from the chaotic environment created by George's worsening alcoholism. Frances's own mental health, already resting on a fragile foundation built over childhood trauma, began to splinter under the relentless stress of her daily life. She developed severe anxiety, a constant humming dread that she learned to mask with impeccable fashion, flawless makeup, and a forced, radiant smile. The ordeal of her first marriage came to an abrupt end in 1936, when George Brokaw suddenly died of a heart attack. At the age of 28, Frances found herself a widow. She was now incredibly wealthy, having inherited a massive fortune, but she was also deeply scarred. The years of abuse, isolation, and unrelenting stress had taken a severe toll on her nervous system. Yet, to the outside world, she was the picture of an elegant, tragic, and highly eligible young widow. She had survived the gilded cage, but the invisible wounds she carried were still bleeding. She desperately needed a safe harbor, a man who could offer her the stability, kindness, and genuine love that had been entirely absent from her life. It was during this vulnerable period of newfound independence and lingering trauma that Frances crossed paths with a rising star of the American stage and screen. His name was Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda was the antithesis of the East Coast, high society world that Frances had known. Born in Grand Island, Nebraska, Henry was the embodiment of Midwestern stoicism. He was tall, striking, and possessed a quiet, understated intensity that was quickly making him a massive star in Hollywood. He had a reputation for being grounded, serious, and deeply dedicated to his craft. To Frances, who had just escaped the volatile, drunken chaos of George Brokaw, Henry's quiet, steady demeanor must have looked like salvation. He appeared to be a rock, a man of few words but profound strength, someone who could anchor her turbulent life and provide the safe, loving family environment she had never experienced. They met through mutual friends, and their courtship was a whirlwind of transatlantic romance. Henry was filming in England at the Denham Studios, and Frances, seeking a change of scenery and an escape from the ghosts of New York, traveled to Europe. They spent time together in London, their romance blossoming against the backdrop of a world teetering on the edge of the Second World War. To Henry, Frances was a vision of sophistication and grace, a wealthy, cultured woman who represented a world entirely different from his humble beginnings. To Frances, Henry was the strong, silent hero she had been waiting for. In September of 1936, just months after the death of her first husband, Frances Ford Seymour married Henry Fonda in a quiet ceremony at Christ Church in New York City. The society papers celebrated the union of the beautiful, wealthy widow and the handsome, rising Hollywood star. It seemed like the ultimate fairy tale ending to Frances's early struggles. They packed up their lives and moved across the country to the sun-drenched hills of Los Angeles, settling into a beautiful farmhouse-style estate on Tigertail Road in the Brentwood neighborhood. Frances was ready to build the perfect life, the perfect family, and the perfect marriage. But as the dust settled on their new Hollywood life, the fundamental cracks in their union began to show. The very qualities that had attracted Frances to Henry, his quietness, his stoicism, his Midwestern reserve, soon revealed themselves to be symptoms of a deep, impenetrable emotional coldness. Henry Fonda, brilliant as he was on screen, was a man profoundly incapable of expressing emotion in his real life. He was a man who could cry on cue in front of a camera, channeling vast reservoirs of empathy for a fictional character, but who would turn entirely to ice in the presence of his own family's emotional needs. For Frances, a woman whose entire psychological structure was built on a desperate need for validation, warmth, and reassurance, Henry's coldness was a slow-acting poison. She had come to him broken, silently begging to be loved and healed, only to find herself married to a man who viewed emotional expression as a weakness and emotional demands as an annoyance. The home on Tigertail Road, meant to be a sanctuary, quickly became a theater of silent tension. In 1937, Frances gave birth to their first child together, a daughter named Jane. 3 years later, in 1940, they welcomed a son, Peter. On paper, they were the ultimate American dream family. Photographs from the era show them lounging by the pool, smiling on the pristine lawns of their estate, the very picture of Hollywood royalty. But the reality inside the walls of the Brentwood estate was chillingly different. Henry was a strict, demanding, and distant father. He expected absolute perfection from his children and his wife, enforcing a rigid household atmosphere where spontaneous emotion was actively discouraged. When he was angry or disappointed, he did not yell or argue. Instead, he utilized a weapon far more devastating to Frances's fragile psyche. He used silence. Henry would go days, sometimes weeks, without speaking a single word to Frances or the children, creating an atmosphere of suffocating tension and unspoken judgment. He would walk through the house like a ghost, his face set in stone, ignoring Frances's desperate attempts to engage him, to apologize for whatever perceived slight had triggered his withdrawal, to beg for a scrap of affection. This emotional starvation had a catastrophic effect on Frances. Her underlying anxieties, the trauma of her childhood, and the scars of her first marriage flared up with terrifying intensity. She began to obsess over her appearance, convinced that if she were only more beautiful, more perfect, thinner, or more glamorous, Henry would finally love her the way she needed to be loved. She underwent numerous cosmetic surgeries, subjecting herself to painful procedures to maintain a flawless facade. She developed severe eating disorders, starving herself to fit into the impossible standards of Hollywood beauty, all while trying to manage a household, raise 3 children, and maintain the public image of the perfectly happy wife. But as investigators and historians of this tragic family dynamic would later find out, this relentless pressure was only the beginning of her descent. The darkest chapters of Frances Fonda's life were yet to be written. The facade was cracking, and the impending storm of a global war would only accelerate the destruction of her fragile world. If this deep dive is keeping you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that notification bell. The darkest secrets are still ahead. When the United States entered the Second World War, Henry Fonda, driven by a deep sense of patriotic duty, enlisted in the United States Navy. He left his acting career, his Hollywood estate, and his family behind to serve his country in the Pacific Theater. For Frances, Henry's departure was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the oppressive, silent tension of his presence was lifted from the house. Without his constant, unspoken judgment hanging over her, Frances found a surprising reserve of strength. She took full control of the household, managing the finances, raising Jane, Peter, and Pan, and dedicating herself to the war effort on the home front. She organized charity events, worked with the Red Cross, and proved to herself and the world that she was capable, intelligent, and resilient. During these war years, The children experienced a rare period of relative peace in the home. Frances, free from the immediate anxiety of trying to please her impossible husband, was able to be a more present and loving mother. She wrote long, detailed letters to Henry, keeping him updated on the children's progress, managing his affairs, and expressing her enduring love and hope that the distance would somehow heal the rift between them. She clung to the romanticized idea that the war would change him, that he would return home with a newfound appreciation for his family, ready to open his heart and be the husband and father she so desperately desired. But when the war ended and Henry Fonda returned to Los Angeles a decorated hero, the fragile peace at the Tiger Tail estate was instantly shattered. The war had not softened Henry. If anything, it had hardened him. He returned more distant, more detached, and more utterly unreachable than ever before. He threw himself back into his acting work, taking on demanding roles that kept him away from the house, and when he was home, the suffocating silence returned with a vengeance. Frances's temporary wartime resilience collapsed under the weight of his renewed rejection. She realized, with a creeping existential horror, that nothing she did would ever be enough. The beautiful home she had maintained, the children she was raising, the flawless appearance she tortured herself to preserve. None of it mattered to Henry. The emotional chasm between them was too vast, and he had absolutely no desire to bridge it. To make matters worse, Henry's eye began to wander. He was a massive star, surrounded by young, beautiful women who demanded nothing of him emotionally, who only saw the glamorous movie star and not the cold, silent man behind closed doors. Frances, acutely aware of her aging in a town that worshipped youth, became increasingly paranoid and insecure. Her mental health began a rapid, terrifying decline. The anxiety that had always been a quiet hum in the background of her life became a deafening roar. She suffered from severe insomnia, pacing the halls of the Brentwood estate late into the night, consumed by a profound, agonizing loneliness. The physical toll of her mental anguish became impossible to hide. She lost an alarming amount of weight, her once radiant face becoming gaunt and haunted. She developed a series of psychosomatic illnesses, seeking help from a parade of doctors who prescribed a cocktail of barbiturates, tranquilizers, and sleeping pills that were standard practice for the era. These medications, rather than curing her, only clouded her mind, deepening her depression, and leaving her increasingly disconnected from reality and from her children. Jane and Peter, still young and entirely dependent on their parents, watched in confusion and terror as their beautiful mother slowly dissolved before their eyes, while their father remained a cold, unmoving statue, seemingly indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in his own home. The breaking point, the final, devastating blow that would shatter Frances completely, arrived in the winter of 1949. Henry, who had been spending more and more time away from the family under the guise of work and theatrical commitments in New York, sat Frances down and delivered a calm, emotionless speech that would end her life as she knew it. He told her he wanted a divorce. He told her that he had fallen in love with another woman. And the most agonizing detail of all, the woman he intended to marry was Susan Blanchard, the stepdaughter of Oscar Hammerstein. Susan was 21 years old. Frances was 41. For Frances, this was not just a rejection. It was an annihilation. Her entire identity, her entire worth in the eyes of the world, was tied to being Mrs. Henry Fonda. She had endured the silence, the coldness, the emotional starvation, all because she believed that keeping the family together was her ultimate duty. To be discarded so easily, replaced by a woman exactly half her age, validated every dark, twisted fear she had harbored since the childhood trauma she had never spoken of. It proved to her broken mind that she was entirely unlovable, entirely worthless, and that her entire life had been a failure. The psychological collapse that followed was total and absolute. Frances spiraled into a deep, clinical depression that the medical community of the 1950s was tragically ill-equipped to handle. She would spend days locked in her bedroom, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to eat, sleep, or function. She spoke of ending her life, her words slurred by heavy sedatives, her eyes vacant and filled with a despair so profound it terrified anyone who saw her. Henry, true to his nature, wanted the problem handled quietly and efficiently. A messy, public breakdown was bad for his image, bad for his career, and entirely incompatible with his desire to move on quickly with his new, young bride. The decision was made to remove Frances from the home, to place her in a facility where she could be managed out of the public eye. In early 1950, Frances Ford Seymour Fonda was admitted to Craig House in Beacon, New York. Craig House was not a typical state-run asylum. It was the premier psychiatric facility for the incredibly wealthy, a place where the elite sent their broken relatives to be hidden away in luxurious surroundings. Located on a sprawling, beautifully manicured estate overlooking the Hudson River, it looked more like a grand country club than a hospital. The facility featured opulent architecture, private suites, tennis courts, a golf course, and an army of discreet, highly trained staff. It was a gilded cage designed to maintain the illusion of high society dignity while locking away the uncomfortable realities of mental illness. Famous figures such as Zelda Fitzgerald and Rosemary Kennedy had spent time within its walls. But beneath the luxurious veneer, Craig House was still a psychiatric institution operating in the dark ages of mental health treatment. The standard protocols of the time included heavy sedation, isolation, insulin shock therapy, and electroconvulsive therapy. Patients were stripped of their autonomy, their schedules rigidly controlled, their communication with the outside world heavily monitored and restricted. For Frances, Craig House was the final confirmation of her complete exile from the world of the living. She was miles away from her children, isolated from her friends, and entirely abandoned by the husband who had broken her. Her daily routine was a numbing cycle of therapy sessions that dug fruitlessly into her immediate marital grief, while completely ignoring the deep, foundational childhood trauma that was the true root of her suffering. She was prescribed more drugs to keep her compliant, to smooth out the jagged edges of her agony so she would not be an imposition on the staff. In her private, beautifully furnished room at Craig House, Frances had hours upon hours of silent, empty time to ruminate on her fate. She wrote desperate, heartbreaking letters to Henry, letters that pleaded for a second chance, letters that begged for him to reconsider, letters that went largely unanswered or were met with cold, legalistic responses drafted by his attorneys. She wrote to her children, trying to maintain a brave face, but the letters were often disjointed, stained with tears and radiating a profound, unbearable sadness. As the cold winter of 1950 bled into the early spring, it became terrifyingly clear to Frances that there was no way out. Henry was moving forward with the divorce at lightning speed, parroting his young fiancée in public, erasing Frances from his narrative as if she had never existed. The society columns that had once celebrated her beauty and her marriage now whispered about her breakdown, her age, and her replacement. She felt she had become a ghost, a useless, discarded thing taking up space in a world that no longer wanted her. The medical staff at Craig House noted her deepening despondency. They observed that she was becoming increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring blankly out the large, barred windows at the rolling lawns of the estate. But they fundamentally underestimated the sheer, terrifying resolve that was calcifying within her. They saw a fragile, broken society wife. They did not see a woman who had finally decided to take the only control left available to her. The precise timeline of how she accomplished her final act remains a chilling testament to her determination. Frances, despite the heavy supervision and the strict rules of the facility, began to carefully, methodically plan her escape from the pain. She needed a weapon, something small, concealable, and brutally effective. The opportunity presented itself through a seemingly innocuous lapse in the hospital's security protocols. During a supervised visit, or perhaps a momentary distraction by the nursing staff, Frances managed to steal a small, single-edged razor blade. She hid the blade with the skill of a desperate survivor. It was her secret, her ultimate insurance policy, a tiny piece of cold steel that represented her final reclamation of power. For days, she carried it hidden in her room, waiting for the precise moment when the hospital routine would grant her the window of uninterrupted isolation she required. That window opened on the morning of April 14th, 1950. April 14th was a significant date. It was Frances's 42nd birthday, The morning routine at Craig House proceeded as usual. The nurses made their rounds, delivering medications and checking on the patients in their luxurious, sunlit rooms. Frances appeared calm, perhaps eerily so. The frantic, weeping desperation that had characterized her early weeks at the facility seemed to have settled into a quiet, cold resolve. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared to be improving, finally accepting her fate. In reality, she had simply crossed the threshold from despair to action. After the morning checks, the staff retreated, leaving the patients to a period of scheduled rest. The heavy oak door of Frances's private suite was pulled shut, muting the sounds of the hospital. She was entirely alone. What went through the mind of Frances Ford Seymour in those final, agonizingly silent moments can only be imagined. Did she think of her beloved daughter Pan? Did she picture the faces of Jane and Peter, the children she was about to leave behind? Did she feel a final, searing flash of rage toward the husband who had discarded her? Or was there only a profound, overwhelming exhaustion, a desperate yearning for the noise in her head to finally stop? She moved into the pristine, tiled bathroom attached to her suite. She closed the door. She retrieved the small, stolen razor blade from its hiding place. With a terrifying, unflinching determination born of absolute despair, Frances brought the blade to her throat. She did not hesitate. The cut was deep, precise, and immediately fatal. She severed her jugular vein, ensuring that there would be no rescue, no revival, no return to the gilded cage of her existence. She collapsed to the cold floor of the bathroom, her life bleeding out rapidly into the pristine white tiles, the agonizing weight of 42 years of trauma, rejection, and silent suffering finally washing away into the dark. A short time later, a nurse arrived at Frances's suite for a routine check. Finding the main room empty, the nurse approached the closed bathroom door. She knocked. There was no answer. The silence that poured from beneath the door was heavy, wrong, and absolute. The nurse opened the door and was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The beautiful, glamorous society wife, the mother of Hollywood's future royalty, lay dead on the floor in a massive pool of her own blood. The alarms were sounded. Doctors rushed into the room, but it was far too late. Frances Ford Seymour was gone. The immediate aftermath of Frances's violent suicide was a masterclass in the cold, ruthless efficiency of the Hollywood machine and the profound emotional dysfunction of Henry Fonda. When the news reached Henry in Los Angeles, his reaction was not one of devastating grief or guilt. Instead, his primary concern was containment. He had to manage the narrative, protect his children from the horrific reality, and shield his own reputation from the inevitable scandal. Henry made a decision that day, a decision rooted in his characteristic inability to handle emotional truth that would inflict a secondary, massive trauma on his children. He decided that Jane, who was 12 years old, and Peter, who was 10, must never know the truth about how their mother died. He gathered the children and, with his trademark stoic, unreadable expression, delivered a fabricated story. He told them that their mother had suffered a sudden, tragic heart attack while recovering at the hospital in New York. There were no tears, no long explanations, no space provided for the children to process their shock and grief. The matter was stated as a cold, clinical fact, and then the door was firmly shut on the subject. Frances was dead, she had died of natural causes, and life would simply carry on. The funeral was handled with the same tight-lipped, emotionless efficiency. Jane and Peter were not allowed to attend. They were kept entirely isolated from the mourning process, left to wander the empty halls of the Brentwood estate, utterly confused and deeply traumatized by the sudden, unexplained erasure of their mother from the world. Henry immediately hired a series of strict nannies and governesses to manage the children, further distancing himself from their emotional needs. Less than 8 months after Frances cut her own throat in the bathroom at Craig House, Henry Fonda married 21-year-old Susan Blanchard. For Jane and Peter, the lie held for a year. They carried the heavy, unspoken burden of their mother's sudden disappearance, living in a house where her name was never spoken. Her photographs quietly removed, her existence practically scrubbed from the historical record of the family. But a secret that large, that violent, and that famous could never stay buried forever. especially not in the gossipy, interconnected world of mid-century America. The horrific truth came to light in the most brutal and impersonal way imaginable. A year after her mother's death, 13-year-old Jane Fonda was sitting in a quiet study hall at her boarding school. A classmate, perhaps out of cruelty, perhaps out of sheer morbid curiosity, passed a movie magazine across the desk to Jane. The magazine contained a sprawling, sensationalized feature article detailing the tragic, dramatic lives of Hollywood stars. There, printed in stark, black and white ink for all the world to read, was the true story of Frances Ford Seymour. The article did not mince words. It described the breakdown, the commitment to Craig House, the stolen razor blade, and the gruesome, bloody details of her suicide. Jane sat frozen in the study hall, staring at the pages as her entire reality violently fractured. The mother, she believed, had died peacefully of a failed heart, had actually been driven to slaughter herself in a locked psychiatric ward. The father she revered had looked her in the eye and lied to her with chilling ease. The entire foundation of her life was built on a massive, horrifying deception. The revelation of this truth acted like a delayed fuse bomb detonating in the lives of the Fonda children. The trauma of the lie, compounded by the horrific nature of the suicide, sent both Jane and Peter spiraling into decades of psychological turmoil. Peter Fonda, who was a deeply sensitive child, was fundamentally broken by the loss and the deception. He developed a profound, agonizing sense of abandonment. Shortly after learning the truth, young Peter accidentally shot himself in the stomach with a pistol he had found, an event that nearly ended his life and was heavily theorized to be a subconscious, desperate cry for the attention and love his father categorically refused to give. He would spend the rest of his life battling the ghosts of his childhood, struggling with authority, seeking solace in the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and channeling his profound, unresolved grief into his iconic role in Easy Rider. Jane Fonda's reaction was entirely different, but equally devastating. She internalized the trauma, burying her immense rage and grief beneath a desperate, lifelong drive for perfection and approval. She developed severe eating disorders, battling bulimia for decades, unconsciously mirroring the exact physical manifestations of her mother's anxiety. She threw herself into her acting career, into relentless political activism, constantly seeking to be seen, to be validated, to prove that she was worthy of the love her father had denied both her and her mother. For years, Jane harbored a deep, complicated resentment toward Frances. She viewed her mother's suicide as the ultimate act of abandonment, a cowardly surrender that left her children entirely at the mercy of a cold, unfeeling father. She bought into the narrative that Henry had implicitly projected, that Frances was simply too weak, too unstable, too flawed to survive. It was not until many decades later, when Jane herself was an older woman, a mother, and a survivor of her own complex life battles, that she finally found the courage to confront the ghosts of her past. Seeking to understand the root of her own lifelong struggles, Jane embarked on a painful, exhaustive investigation into the life of Frances Ford Seymour. She requested and finally obtained the sealed medical records from Craig House. She read the doctor's notes, the psychiatric evaluations, and, most devastatingly, the letters her mother had written in her final days. As Jane pored over the yellowing pages, a profoundly different picture of her mother emerged. She did not find a weak, hysterical woman. She found a woman who had been fighting a terrifying silent war against unimaginable demons her entire life. It was within these pages that Jane finally discovered the horrific truth of Frances's childhood sexual abuse. Suddenly, the entire tragic puzzle of her mother's life snapped into sharp, agonizing focus. Frances was not weak. She was a survivor of horrific trauma who had been forced to navigate a society that offered no help, no understanding, and no grace. She had desperately sought safety in the arms of men who only used her or ignored her. She had been subjected to the emotional torture of Henry Fonda's silence, a silence that perfectly replicated the isolation of her childhood abuse. When Jane read the details of the treatments at Craig House, the sheer, unyielding despair her mother faced, and the absolute abandonment by the man who was supposed to protect her, the lifelong resentment melted into profound, overwhelming empathy and sorrow. Jane finally understood that her mother did not want to leave her children. Her mother simply could not survive the unbearable, crushing weight of her own mind any longer. The suicide was not an act of abandonment. It was the tragic, inevitable collapse of a structure that had been fatally compromised from the very beginning. In her memoirs and public interviews, Jane Fonda would later speak with immense grace and forgiveness about the mother she barely knew. She took the shame out of the shadows, speaking openly about Frances's mental illness, her trauma, and the lethal consequences of societal silence. By uncovering the truth, Jane retroactively gave her mother the voice, the understanding, and the compassion she was entirely denied in life. The story of Frances Fonda remains one of the darkest, most heartbreaking chapters in the history of Hollywood. It is a story that brutally strips away the glamorous veneer of the golden age, revealing the terrifying human cost of maintaining the perfect image. Frances was a woman born into a cage of privilege, traumatized in silence, starved of love, and ultimately driven to destroy herself in the cold, sterile bathroom of an institution designed to hide her away. Her legacy is a complex one. She is the mother of two cinematic legends, the grandmother of actors who continue the family dynasty. But more importantly, her tragic end serves as a chilling, necessary reminder of the lethal power of emotional cruelty, the devastating impact of unhealed childhood trauma, and the absolute necessity of empathy in the face of mental illness. Frances Ford Seymour did not die because she was weak. She died because she was forced to carry an unbearable burden entirely alone in the dark. Thank you for watching the full video. What are your theories on the dynamics of the Fonda family? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Join us next time for another deep dive into the hidden truths of history.